This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
On the internet today, a lot of people talk about taking the red pill. This term has become prominent in right-wing circles, where taking the red pill is considered the key rite of passage, and is used ubiquitously for evangelization into right-wing ideas. The phrase is overused, but it conjures a powerful image, and one that's been drilled into our psyche, if nothing else, than by Hollywood and one famous movie scene. The red pill, an ideological transformation that destroys one world just as it opens up another. Although there are many voices on the internet who claim to be purveyors of this red pill, usually from a conservative or reactionary point of view, from my own experience, this term of taking the red pill is most closely associated with a little-known reactionary blogger named Curtis Yavin, who blogged under the pseudonym Mencius Molebug. Although a rather obscure writer, the blog of Mencius Molebug, Unqualified Reservations, remained incredibly influential to counter-progressive thought right up until the present year. But despite the influence, very few people read Mencius Molebug. This owes, I think, mainly to the fact that his blog posts remain rather unwieldy and inaccessible, stretching to book length while still maintaining the rather casual conversational tone. This can be difficult to people who prefer to have their ideas encapsulated in a much more digestible format. Since I commonly cite Mencius Molebug as being one of the thinkers that most influenced my own thoughts, many people have asked me to do a summary video of Molebug's ideas. And while it's certainly impossible to do an overview of all of the ideas that Molebug covered across 2 years of blogging, I think I can, in a relatively short lecture, outline some of the core ideas that were important to my own intellectual development. So, to start this lecture, let me return to the concept of taking the red pill. Today, everyone knows the red pill for its associations with the right wing, and with the internet communities of 4chan and Gab.ai, but the first time I was exposed to the term the red pill, in a political context at least, was in my freshman diversity seminar, the same type of ideologically oriented indoctrination class that is so frequently complained about from voices on the mainstream right. I remember my professor walking in and telling us all that this course about privilege would allow us to see the true operation of society. Understanding power and oppression was like taking the red pill in the Matrix. Just as Neo was eventually able to see the ones and zeros behind the virtual reality world in which he was trapped, so too would these tools of diversity and intersectionality allow us to see the strings behind our own world. These ideas would be a mechanism for ideological liberation. Strangely enough, however, moving through my college career in a more or less apolitical manner, I noticed something after I graduated from college when looking at my peers. While in high school, I remember many people being Republicans and having sympathies for the moderate right or even the libertarian right at times. Upon graduation from college, I remember not being able to name any one of my peers who voted Republican, or even who deviated greatly from the left party line within the Democratic establishment. While I did come from a blue state, and this type of general bias to the left should have been expected, it did seem for a moment that college had been a mechanism for generating more blue state Americans, more loyal Democrats. Myself being something of a libertarian, a left-leaning libertarian, I still had a bit of the old red American values in me. Occasionally I'd flip through the pages of the National Review or read a right-wing blog just to get a new point of view. And so looking at the relative ideological uniformity of my peers seems strange. Was conservative media right that college had been a giant indoctrination zone? It certainly seemed like a mechanism for getting people to vote Democrat, if nothing else. Of course, things were more complicated when I brought this reality to people school, either my peers or my parents' generation, I was usually told that this was not taking into consideration the nuances in political opinion. There were a good deal of disagreements inside the general left wing. College had produced some communists, some socialists, feminists, environmentalists, and even some good old-fashioned liberals. The fact that they all voted Democrat was merely a coincidence, a product of corporate media, and also a consequence of the fact that the Republican Party was just so egregious that nobody of a well-educated disposition could possibly sympathize. The general division between the left and the right didn't really mean anything if one was intellectually serious, after all. Moderates all strive to be bipartisan, whereas radicals, say for instance like Noam Chomsky, or on the right Alex Jones, seem to agree that the party system, the division we have between left and right wing across one dimension, was a product of the military-industrial complex, two stooges put forward to represent a fake debate. Nevertheless, the division between the two poles, between left and right, between blue America and red America, just seemed to reassert itself again and again in real life. I found many of the moderates who constantly talked about cooperation and bipartisanship yell the loudest when it came election time and time to finally choose between one party or the other. How did this make any sense? More telling yet, the radicals who assured me always that both the Democrat and the Republican Party were inside the pockets of the military-industrial corporate complex seemed to still respect left versus right distinctions, and even party loyalties when it came right down to it. Noam Chomsky and Alex Jones might paint as bleak a picture as they want about the political situation and the meaninglessness of Republican versus Democrat politics, but Noam Chomsky, despite his radical pretensions, was never going to cooperate with Alex Jones, and you were much more likely to find Noam Chomsky or any other Chomsky fan rubbing elbows with mainstream Democrats like Barack Obama than you were to ever see him come even within speaking distance of your average radical right-wing anti-government type. Whatever anyone else said, I was left to conclude that on an emotional level, and at the level of real political action, the division between left and right was very real, and possibly more important than anyone was actually ready to admit. As I continued reading both right-wing and left-wing blogs, as I continued a media diet that was perhaps much more ideologically diverse than my contemporaries, I began to look for differences between the left and the right that might explain the intense emotional division between the two sides of America. At first, one could immediately notice a difference in the language that conservatives and progressives use to describe themselves and their objectives. The right talked about preserving the promise of America. The left talked about the oppressed and the need to reform our standards to be more tolerant. The right talked about patriotism and loyalty, where the left talked about social justice. The right talked about the left's hypocrisy and how things weren't fair. The left talked about how the right was cruel and how we needed to overcome the tyranny of the past and look forward. In all of this rhetoric, I saw a key distinction between how the left and the right conceptualized themselves. The left was fundamentally forward-looking, and the right was fundamentally backwards-looking. And this, of course, seemed increasingly strange. It might be one thing for each side to claim a direction, as in their name, left versus right. There might be a legitimate debate over how to steer our country and our civilization, just like we might debate over whether to steer a car left or right. But how can there be a legitimate debate between the future and the past? I can turn the steering wheel of a car in any direction, but it's pointless to argue whether I can drive into the future or the past. I'm obviously going into the future. There can't be a debate over who wins, tomorrow or yesterday. Tomorrow always does. And this distinction was further underlined by the common, and increasingly common in the late 2000s, progressive bromide that they were on the right side of history. Of course, this had the standard overconfidence of any other political bromide, but at the same time it was very clear, talking to any progressive person, or really any Democrat in the late 2000s, that progressives really believed this. They really believed that there was a force in history that would grant their ideas ultimate victory and vindication. Being one of the few people in my social circles who had a fair number of right-wing friends, I remember bringing the phrase, the right side of history, to them several times, and discussing their opinions on the matter. More or less, as I suspected, they dismissed it. History doesn't have a direction. This is just a leftover from the Hegelian Marxist notion that human nature is moving to some ultimate culmination. This is nothing but progressive overconfidence. Just watch. History will prove them wrong. But would history prove them wrong? Was there a direction in history? The question was strange. There really shouldn't be. I had no reason to expect there would be. But looking backwards across the timeline, I could see a different story forming up. Suppose, for instance, we took one of our standard conservative commenters, a Ben Shapiro, and began to send him back in time, in 100-year increments. We could send him back to the year 1918, and introduce him to the right-wingers of that era. Would they consider him right-wing? Almost certainly not. His views would undoubtedly be on the left wing of the political spectrum during that period. Moreover, if we were to take Ben Shapiro and a right-winger from 1918 and send them back another 100 years, a similar pattern would follow. The right-winger of 1818 would be to the right of the right-winger in 1918, and the right-winger in 1918 would be to the right of Ben Shapiro, and on it goes, throughout the period of Enlightenment, throughout the period of the Reformation. The figure whom we take from the past is always to the right, and the figure taken from the future is always to the left. And this pattern would persist even before the French Revolution, even before the terms left-wing versus right-wing were developed as part of the National Assembly. We have an intuitive understanding of what right and left means. And in every single comparison, the right is more primitive and the left is more futuristic. This is an interesting pattern in history, and one that has not been unremarked upon by intellectuals. Even in our present age, people have often commented on this, from Richard Dawkins to Barack Obama, yet explanations of the phenomenon are very hard to come by. The most evocative and, in my mind, most useful formulation of this general left-wing pattern in history was stated most succinctly by the historian and poet Robert Conquest, and his very famous 3 laws of politics. Number 1, everyone is conservative about what he knows best. 2, any organization not explicitly right-wing sooner or later becomes left-wing. And 3, the simplest way to explain the behavior of any bureaucratic organization is to assume that it is controlled by a cabal of its enemies. I like this formulation of the general left-wing direction in history because of its added specificity. No longer talking about general trends in between centuries, we can see quite clearly that not only history, but institutions themselves over the course of their development have a general left-wing tilt. The formulation of Conquest's laws even have a strange paradox attached to them. With the first law saying that we are all conservative about the things that we know best, it is hard, therefore, to explain why institutions, and subsequently history itself, always seems to go to the left. For a while, Robert Conquest's laws were a chief point of interest for myself, and I brought them up in conversations with both progressives and conservatives alike. And I found another strange asymmetry. Conservatives were very ready to accept the first law, and while they sometimes grudgingly accepted the second one, they nevertheless had no explanation for it. Similarly, progressives were quite fond of denying outright the first law. But I found, nevertheless, that the law was true about the very progressives who wanted to deny it, at least if you replaced knew best with loved. The feminist who denied Robert Conquest's first law was always in the process of defending feminism from its critics, of conserving the women's studies department and making sure that its own institutional power was secured. The anti-capitalist union organizer nevertheless wanted to conserve and enhance the power of labor. And what left-wing third world nationalist, fresh from talking about the hegemony of the United States, wasn't fastened on the idea of increasing the hegemony of his own people? Again and again, Robert Conquest's first law was shown to be true, even in the face of progressives' attempt to deny it. However, progressives had a much easier time with Robert Conquest's second law, because the answer was so simple. Well, of course, institutions and history always move to the left, because the left is correct. I remember thinking about this argument and trying to take it seriously. How could the left just be correct again and again and again throughout history? Certainly the most believable explanation I could come up with was that this was all post hoc reasoning. We cast our gaze backwards throughout history and label all of the correct policy choices to be on the left. Thus, retroactively, of course, creating the appearance that the left was always right, calling the left correct only because we changed the definition of what was left every time we knew what was correct. Of course, while being somewhat parsimonious, this explanation ultimately didn't make very much sense, for the simple fact that we already knew what left was before we determined who ultimately would win political conflicts and who would lose. In the 19th century, they did not yet know whether the Royalists or the Republican factions would win, but everyone knew that the Royalists were on the right and the Republicans were on the left. Similarly, I, as a contemporary American, do not know who will be ultimately vindicated in the debate over abortion. I don't know whether pro-choice or pro-life will win, but I do know that pro-life is right-wing and pro-choice is left-wing. The category exists before the prediction. Of course, yet another way to possibly explain the leftward force in history is to identify left-wing thought simply with the application of reason and evidence-based empiricism. Perhaps we are persistently moving left the same way that we are persistently getting better and better technology, and the same way that we are persistently developing better and better scientific models. We move left because we improve our knowledge, because it itself is another name for evidence-based methodology. When we say the word left, all we mean is that policy recommendation that came from an honest application of empiricism and rationality. But once more, this seems to fall short. In addition to being a little bit emotionally dissonant, if we were to accept this worldview, we would have to accept that even the most radical left-wing issues, from transgenderism for children, to limitless abortion, to complete open borders, to immediate implementation of state-run socialism, are all empirically derived, and eventually, at least, will be vindicated by the force of human history. Still more things don't add up with the association of the left with simple, rational empiricism. Leftist ideas, in and of themselves, contain their own methodology, which we can clearly recognize before they're implemented or tested. Any layperson can identify a left-wing idea, whether or not he knows it's vindicated by science. And this should be very unusual. It would never occur in a scientific discipline, or even an engineering one. Any layperson can tell you they want a better iPhone, but it would be very odd if a layperson could tell you how to make the iPhone better in a scientific engineering fashion. If he could just say something like add more zinc and immediately be vindicated by that specific methodology resulting in a better iPhone. Similarly, we know certain ideas are left-wing even before they've been tested. Will an open borders policy work for the West? I don't know, but I sure as heck know that it's a left-wing idea. We can call ideas left-wing that aren't even part of the political discourse. I'm sure that at some point in the future, people are going to move on from being transgender to being trans-species, and want extensive biological work to live as animals. This is nowhere on our political discourse, although you can see, I think, the foreshadowing of it on the internet. Still, I'm pretty sure that the trans-species liberation movement will be a movement on the left, regardless of whether it's ultimately vindicated by experimentation and methodological research that is honestly done. And so, with both of these easy explanations out of the way, we are left still with a mystery. If the left is indeed on the winning side of history, if in fact the course of human events has a well-known left-wing bias, what is the cause of it? How can we explain it in a methodological sense? And here, of course, we get to the heart of the matter. For Mencius Mollbug, the problem with this general left-wing tendency towards history was much more than just a strange historical occurrence. For Mollbug, this was an indication that we needed to radically reconceptualize the nature of power, cultural consensus, and history itself in the modern world. The problem begins with how we conceptualize power and political consensus. Given now that in the modern world, our own political reality, and the reality that rules the academy, is fundamentally post-Enlightenment, we have come to believe a certain number of myths about human nature. Myths that, if you actually press people on it, they will readily admit that they are false, even though we are expected to assert them publicly. We live in a democratic republic, what we call, in somewhat of a misnomer, a democracy, a place where citizens are looked to be the final arbiter of how society unfolds. As such, we are encouraged to believe that citizens are rational, that they take their cultures, the problems faced by their current society, and their own personal interests, and come up with an opinion, through public discourse, that they think is best for addressing the problems of the nation and the polity as a whole. We are expected to believe that through public discourse, the exchange of information, and the testing of those opinions inside a political environment, a consensus that is more or less correct will be reached, and this will become the new ruling democratic majority. Most people who are reasonably aware of human nature, including the very founding fathers who originated this system, are and were perfectly aware that this model of human discourse is entirely fictitious. People are influenced by any number of other factors. Mob mentalities emerge, appealing ideas that are wrong spread like wildfire, and certain swings in public opinion are readily observable. As Winston Churchill so famously said, a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth can even get its pants on. And it's true, bad ideas do have a way of spreading, even though they are wrong, almost like a disease or a virus. It might be useful in many ways to model the spreading of bad ideas as viruses. In fact, this has become a quite popular mode of conceptualizing human knowledge post-2007, especially in the wake of thinkers like Daniel Dennett. Religion is like a mind virus. Radical Islam is like a mind virus. Nazism, communism, socialism are like mind viruses. They spread from person to person, irrespective of their veracity. Here, I think it comes as no surprise that very few people describe ideas that they hold as viruses. But to take this model seriously, what would happen if we did model all ideas as viruses? Returning to our initial example at least, modeling the right versus left, or in the American context, the red versus blue dynamic, as if both were viruses of the mind, taking control of their hosts and spreading for their own interests, and not because they were believed or not believed. Which virus would be the more powerful strain? The left-wing blue virus or the right-wing red virus? Which would be the strain that would most likely cause a pandemic? We can examine each closely in turn. The red right-wing virus transmits itself mainly through institutions like churches, small communities, rural organizations, and families. It likes targeting the populations of Middle America, the rural poor, the military, and far-flung conservative religious communities. Its transmission mechanism is slower, intergenerational, and genetic, and in our present age, it captures generally old power and those who are in the center of things. By contrast, our blue left-wing virus likes working through mass media institutions, the government, and school systems. It likes targeting populations of urban professionals, celebrities, teachers, and academics. Its transmission mechanisms are fast, mimetic, and media-oriented. The blue virus captures the poor and the ascendant, but also the richest and most powerful heights of our present society. Now, given this perspective and brief rundown, we immediately can see that these two viruses are in no way equal. Imagine, for instance, looking at this diagram, we were betting men, and we were trying to predict which virus would capture more power and influence in the long term if unleashed upon a population. Which would you choose, red or blue? Well, the blue virus, obviously. What is Middle America and a vast population of fuddy-duddies next to the commanding heights of media, education, and the coastal corporate elite? Once more, the victor is the left with a bullet. We often look upon the contemporary contest between left and right, red America versus blue America, as if it were the contest between two equal and opposite forces. But this, in the mind of Mencius Mollbug, is a ridiculous proposition. The left has more cultural power. I remember making these initial observations about left versus right in the middle of the Bush administration, where there was no end of progressive bellyaching about how out of power and marginalized the left wing was in the contemporary political environment. And even before reading Mencius Mollbug, I remember thinking that this was bullshit. The majority of the governmental, educational, media, and research institutions that my peers interacted with in their daily lives, and that my peers would interact with going forward, were totally dominated by the left wing. The only thing that was dominated by the right, the only thing that could be dominated by the right, was the upper level of the federal government, an office that shifted between the left wing and the right wing of the political spectrum every 4 to 8 years. Would my progressive friends seriously trade their dominance in the academy, the government, and the social services for another 8 years of power in the presidency and the Congress? Would progressive people feel more comfortable in an America where the school systems and universities were Republican if only Al Gore had won the 2000 presidential election? Obviously not. What became clear to myself, and also coincidentally Mencius Mollbug, was that when it came to setting the cultural tone and the overarching narrative of society, the left was dominant. In fact, not just dominant, but unassailable. Moreover, it was this cultural consensus that ultimately determined where the country would go in the long run. Although we have a two-party system, Mencius Mollbug pointed out that it might be better to model Democrats and Republicans less as the left and right wing of an assembly, and more as the inner and outer parties of a single fixture, like in the novel 1984. The inner party develops the real agenda and the outline of where society is going in the long term. The outer party exists more or less as a peanut gallery, taking power temporarily and moving in the same direction as the inner party wants, but at a slower speed. The main utility of the outer party is creating the perception of opposition and discourse for what really is a predetermined conclusion. Now, while this analogy Mollbug uses is quite illustrative, it is important here to point out that he is not proposing a giant conspiracy, as was depicted in Orwell's 1984, but rather a consensus. Despite what Alex Jones might think, the leaders of the Democratic Party, Hollywood, and the corporate elite aren't gathering together in a smoke-filled room and determining what the consensus of the cultural norms are going to be in America. Instead, there is just a general consensus, a general agreement that has emerged among elites, and that people who enter the elite are encouraged to believe. But if we live in a truly open society, an open democratic project, then how can this consensus even emerge to begin with? Here, Mencius Mollbug takes aim at the concept of the open society, as described by people like Karl Popper. What if we conceptualized social control more broadly than simply an open democratic republic versus a closed totalitarian or authoritarian system? Say, for instance, if we modeled a completely open society as a Type 1 society, one that had almost no controls on the types of ideas that could be said or thought about in any way, shape, or form. To contrast this, we could compare it to a totally closed society, like North Korea, where every aspect of a person's life is completely controlled by ideology, by ideas that have to be asserted, and asserted enthusiastically within every communal interaction. Now, while these pure Type 3 societies are exceedingly rare in human history, very few governments want total social control over a people's ideology, I think it is fair to say that the pure Karl Popper Type 1 society has never really existed. In fact, Mollbug goes on to point out that in terms of social control, most of what a society does to maintain order is done through a loose societal consensus over what is acceptable and what is not. This consensus is usually not designed and exists pre-politically, operating mainly through social pressure and originating in the academic and educational institutions in society. This consensus-generating system is loose and fluid. It extends over governments, in between them, creating sort of an unofficial multinational method of thinking and rules for determining what ideas are good and what ideas are unacceptable. The classic example of this is none other than the medieval society that originated in Europe post 1000 AD and persisted until the Reformation, where the Catholic Church and the strictures set aside by the Catholic Church were the de facto societal consensus. It didn't matter whether your loyalties lied to the Holy Roman Empire, to France or to Britain, to Hungary or the Kingdom of Poland. At the end of the day, you had been educated under Catholic guidelines, you asserted Catholic religious beliefs, and you had a Christian and scholastic methodology about solving problems. This is what Mollbug called the cathedral, and it, more than anything else, is what defines a civilization. It is an organized system of consensus about how a society should run and should be operated going into the future. Implicitly, this is a very useful term when it comes to understanding our own political environment. What is the advantage the Democratic Party has? Well, in short, the Democratic Party is aligned to the desires of the cathedral, the general consensus of the academy, and others who generate ideas about how society should move forward. Everyone else are heretics to a certain degree, acceptable heretics in most cases, but nevertheless out of sync with where the correct opinion is. Alright, we have come up with an idea of the cathedral, perhaps a better way of explaining political dynamics in contemporary America. But how does this help in better understanding the dynamics of history, the reason why the societal consensus, or the cathedral if you will, always shifts to the left? What creates this left-wing force in history? Here, I might be permitted one more digression to one almost forgotten English political party, the Whigs. Now, while the Whigs' political objectives in the near term are now almost forgotten and not relevant for this talk, they, and their later sympathizers in the 19th century, were famous for first pointing out this constant change in history, this direction of reform and improvement that seems to go on in one direction. This is, of course, the Whig view of history, as it is famously explained. A funny, anachronistic juxtaposition, however, that still might give us some insight into this reforming force of history, is done by overlaying the Whig view of history with Samuel Johnson's equally famous quote about the Whigs, that indeed Lucifer himself was the first Whig. Here, while I think Samuel Johnson's original point was that Lucifer was the first rebel against the crown's interest, the crown being God, might we not better understand the leftward direction of history if we incorporate a Luciferian element into our analysis? By assuming, in contrast, that history moves left because the left is always correct, with history moves to the left because the left is always evil. At once it seems like we may have replaced an explanation that is overly flattering to the leftists with an explanation that is overly flattering to conservatives and those who oppose the left. Still, if we vary our analogy a little bit and move to the realm of physics, we might ask ourselves if the fundamental, time-dependent force in history that moves everything to the left is not equivalent to, or at least analogous to, the fundamental time-dependent phenomenon in physics, what physicists call entropy. What if progress, what if the leftward force in history is simply entropy, dissolution, degeneration? Just like a teacup in nature, once knocked down, shatters, but does not, in nature, reassemble itself. Perhaps the tendency of all things in nature to become more left-wing is a type of shattering, a type of winding down, a phenomenon where societies and social institutions themselves slowly are degraded as time progresses. Under this explanation, we see once more that the left-wing push in history, the Whig explanation of history, if you will, does have a certain Luciferian nature. Progress is simply a move towards more chaos, as history inevitably goes forward into the future. As society moves forward, institutions are not so much improved by progress, but slowly torn down, stripped of their fundamentals, and worn away. As Mollbug would put it, Cthulhu swims slowly, but he always swims to the left. Certainly, this explanation has a certain parsimonious nature to it. Things of their own accord tend to wind down, tend to fall apart. Institutions tend to fall apart over time, just like things in the physical world. We don't need a further explanation. The identification of the left wing with entropy, with slow degeneration, also goes a long way at explaining why the left tends to win over time, and also why we can identify what is left and what isn't before it actually does win. We are not clairvoyant, we are not seeing the future in any incredible way, any more than we are noticing that a teacup once smashed is not going to reassemble itself. Still, this explanation is vague. It's all well and good, as Mencius Moldbug does, to associate the left with entropy, but what exactly is being degenerated? What is wasting away? Dissolution and chaos, from analogy to religion and analogy to physics, tends to have a negative connotation. If you were to ask me whether I want my society to be degenerated, I would probably say no, simply out of emotional association. Yet still, we haven't specified yet what is being degenerated. What if it's something bad? What if what is slowly melting away is oppression? In that case, the entropic model of the left would still be more or less correct, but the left would still be a good thing, at least under most people's views. So what is being degenerated and destroyed over time? Well, it can't be living standards. Things have gotten better for the most part. We might be more progressive than those old fogies in the early 18th century, and perhaps this means we are more chaotic in the Jordan Peterson sense of the word, but in terms of wealth and technology, we are by far their superiors. We may be in the process of dissolution societally, we may be degenerating, but if technology and wealth increases, we'll be degenerating all the way to the bank. So if our living standards aren't degenerating, what is actually the subject of the left's entropy? Well, as Moldbug would put it in a word, or at least a Greek word, nomos, rules, laws, customs, and implicitly the promises and commitments that stem from those rules and customs. And here, of course, we mean rules and laws in the most general sense, in the broadest cultural sense, saying that all men should take their hat off before the king is part of nomos. But so is saying that boys should wash their hands before supper, saying that all good churchmen should observe the holy days of obligation is nomos, and so is the military draft. And here we come to a simple explanation of what is left, and what is, by converse, right. The left is antinomian, the right is pronomian. If we look at human organization through history, and human organizations generally, we see that each in turn are made up of promises and rules. One person, usually an authority, promises something to those who are lower, and in exchange he is raised up in the hierarchy and is able to make the rules for the rest of society. This is a very basic model, but you will see it again and again in everything from the establishment of ancient civilizations and kings to corporate boardrooms. You also even see it in the case of religions and gods. It is no accident that the first religious testament that we have in the Bible concerns the development of a covenant, a promise made by God, and subsequently rules set out to govern the people in order that God can fulfill that promise. The core cultural element that binds a society together on a political and pre-political level. Alright, so this might be an observation about how society is formed, but how does this play into our idea of reform and possibly the dissolution of institutions? Well, as we might expect, with promises and rules, the social order of a society, or really any institution, can't remain static. Norms need to be modified to accommodate changes. There needs to be some flexibility and modification. Some rules need to be renegotiated, or possibly even reneged on. Things change. But here comes a problem. When one makes a rule or a promise in turn, one limits possibilities and potential. Human operations are constrained. By breaking a rule, we are more liberated. We are free to make new commitments and to enjoy life in an unconstrained fashion. However, if we break promises and break faith with the rules that are made at any given time, the authority that is making those promises and making those rules loses credibility. The entire system is weakened and potentially even collapses. At some point, if we break too many rules, nothing works, and here there is a trade-off that all civilizations need to make. How loose do we want to be with our own rules and promises? For want of an immediate analogy in the modern world, we could use the monetary system, and the printing of promissory notes on paper currency. Issuing the initial currency is like an initial covenant with the people and their creditors. We print bills and then borrow those bills to buy what we need and what we think we can pay back in the future. However, as the people and the government go into debt, it finds it necessary to break, or rather bend, its promises in the printing of promissory notes by printing more and more money, inflating the currency, making it easier to pay its debts, and in turn, easier to borrow and spend money as it wants, worry-free. However, print too many promissory notes, and people will lose faith with the currency. There will be hyperinflation, an accelerating, metastasizing collapse of the society, and the ability of anyone to use money to negotiate for things that they need. For perhaps yet another simpler example, we might imagine the trade-off between pronomian and antinomian perspectives, the trade-off between strict rules and loose ones, being like the ant and the grasshopper from the famous Aesop's fables. The rule says work every day, hard, to store for the winter. Break the rule one day and you get a nice day off, a break in the ordinary pattern of existence and a chance to enjoy life. But break the rule every day, as the grasshopper in the title of the fable, and you will starve come winter. And so it goes with societies. The rules can be bent, but if they're broken, all hell breaks loose, things fall apart, order breaks down, trust evaporates, and men cannot rely on their fellow men. And therein we can imagine, again, a balance, a pattern that takes place in most societies. The antinomian, bleeding heart grasshoppers telling society to make exceptions, to ease up, to let loose, to take a break from the promises and rules that define the society. The pronomian, fuddy-duddy ants sticking to order and the old ways, and cautioning society that if it does ease up, that if it does slack from its duties, that if it does show too much mercy, the world will come to a bad end, society will starve come winter, and the barbarian hordes will be at the gates. But after everything, does this explain the progressive direction of history over the long term? Well, not really. If there was a trade-off like this, we would expect that our world would be simpler, that equilibrium would be reached, and that history itself would involve small cycles between these two forces, rather than a single direction. And this type of cyclical equilibrium might be the case if nothing changed. But of course, things do change. In particular, technology changes. Human beings do gain knowledge of the world over time, and we pass it on, generation to generation. We do improve our understanding, increase our yields, improve our efficiencies, and generate larger margins and cushier boundaries between our families and the hardness of natural existence. And under these circumstances, the calls of the antinomians to loosen the rules, and loosen the punishments, and partially renege on our promises, turn out more often than not to be vindicated. One can imagine a dialogue, hypothetically, between a right pronomian and a left antinomian. Pronomian: the law says work the earth from sunup to sundown. Antinomian: but with the newly invented plows and crop rotations, we need less work. Pronomian: idle hands are the devil's plaything. Antinomian: come, let us enjoy the fruits of our leisure time. I don't think it's hard to see what eventually wins. Technology and wealth come to liberate us from the regulations and strictures we needed to maintain survival in a harsher world, in past worlds. The antinomian triumphs once more due to technology, the progressive obtains victory, and the path of history obtains its well-known leftward bias. And through technology and the loosening of norms, humanity is happier, or at least richer, and we return to the pursuit of our goals as people and as civilization with more ease. As technology accelerates, so does the left increase its own ability to become vindicated again and again in its antinomianism, in its tearing down of rules, customs, and in turn promises. We have finally come to accomplish our task, an explanation of the leftward force in history that explains both the simplicity of progressivism and the predictability and persistence of its victories. Moldbug's model seems to explain the nature of the left and also the predictability of history, the Hegelian idea that the processes of history are intelligibly moving to some kind of condition or outcome. Moving back to our timeline of conservatives, we can see that at every interval, what separates each conservative from the last, what makes Ben Shapiro more progressive than the early 20th century conservative, and what makes the early 20th century conservative more progressive than his 19th century counterpart, is their relationship to the disestablishment of institutional norms, of their belief that certain rules should be done away with or relaxed, that the promises of the older society should be loosened. We have also, with some effort, been able to successfully explain the first two of Conquest's 3 laws of politics, unlike, I may point out, both the contemporary liberal and conservative commenters. We see that people are more conservative about the things that they love because they're looking to preserve them, and we see that institutions, by their nature, become more progressive or liberal over time because they wind down and degenerate. So, in recognizing that the leftward force of history is driven by humans' technological progress, how do we feel about it? Is not this entire process a good thing? Should we not be grateful for it? Is this not a victory over nature? A victory for humanity? A vindication of the concept of human progress? Well, perhaps, but perhaps not. This type of progress may be the ultimate salvation of humanity. But is there not a fly in the ointment, a critical flaw in the plan? In addition to simply progress or degeneration, whatever you prefer, there's another way of viewing the struggle between antinomian and pronomian forces, or the left and the right, and that is as a transfer. Originally evolving and living in a harsh natural environment, human beings need norms, disciplines, and strictures to ensure that they will survive. And this need for norms persists and perhaps even increases when the dangers of human organization move from being more natural to also involving war and other human rivalries on a large scale. In this sense, technological development acts as sort of a trade-off, replacing internalized human technologies of a disciplined rules and organization with external physical technologies that can offload some of the work. As we invent the lever and the pulley, the discipline put on our muscles can be loosened. As we invent inscription, writing, and stone tablets, we lose the discipline needed to memorize and carry on long oral traditions. Sometimes the technology replaces one discipline, such as memorization, with another, the disciplines involved in writing. Other times, as in the case of modern technological and information entertainment, the core human disciplines are eroded entirely, as modern man becomes increasingly atomized, sedentary, and isolated, losing his contact with both the land and also his fellow man. In this sense, the progress of technology and its subsequent progressivizing influence is a double-edged sword, increasing our wealth but also eroding our humanity. Through progress and the destruction of norms, we erode the rules, orders, disciplines, and promises that would otherwise allow our society to survive in harsher conditions. This is a fundamental decadence, and in Mollbug's conception, technological innovation covers up the degeneration and social disorder that would otherwise be obvious. More fundamentally, in the progress of technology and antinomianism, there is no guarantee that the loosening of the rules and the destruction of promises is only going to impact superfluous institutions that are immediately obsoleted by the emergence of technology. As the victories of the antinomian left accrue again and again, as it is further vindicated by technology, the demands will accelerate. The activists on the left will begin to tear down more and more norms, more and more rules, until it begins to cut into living tissue, until it begins to destroy the social organization that society needs to go forward and generate the very technological advance that is needed to justify the leftward antinomian direction in politics to begin with. History does have a leftward direction, but there's no guarantee that it is going to be intelligent about it. Like an autoimmune disorder, the fixture begins attacking healthy tissue, and even while being driven by the progress of technology, there's no guarantee that the antinomian forces it inspires will be at all good for humanity in the long run. Of course, on the surface, both of these defects are rather small, but they can become bigger since there is no implicit mechanism in society to deal with them once they fully accelerate. And so we have a bubble mechanism built into the pattern of history itself. The growth of wealth and technology enables the victories of the left, enables the victories of antinomian forces in society. But soon, the march of progress overtakes the benefits delivered by technology, and begins to degenerate and disintegrate social bonds themselves. Just like a market bubble, the societal or civilizational bubble starts by pursuing a useful, valued asset, creates hype and enthusiasm until everything is oversold, and then collapses, destroying the wealth of the people who were foolish enough to invest in it. When a bubble is in its growth period, when the market is in an upswing, when technology and wealth are abundant, if you buy into a bubble, there's immediate benefit. And if you deconstruct social norms or remove social rules that seem unnecessary in the short term, there is much to be gained in the short term. Therefore, an acceleration is experienced that is almost irresistible. Society will go ever further to the left, ever further into deconstruction, until it begins to devour itself. And even within this process, will the leftward movement and acceleration of history always continue towards the left, always continue towards further deconstruction? Well, as the economist Herbert Stein put it, if something cannot go on forever, it will, inevitably, at some point stop. And so, for societies like ours, there are, in fact, two possible endings. In one very unlikely scenario, I hesitate to say optimistic scenario, the process of technological and wealth growth continues, almost indefinitely, until science and technology have obliterated scarcity, and with it, any remnant of anything resembling humanity or the human condition as we understand it today. In this scenario, nothing stops progress. We reach a state of techno-utopia, or go even further and attain what Ray Kurzweil would call the singularity, the point where technology devours humanity itself. In this scenario, we will have reached some kind of culmination, some kind of perfect technology, or existence in almost a godlike state. Although, I hesitate to say we, since whatever attains this true dizzying height of existence is not going to resemble anything that is human. However, in the other scenario that is much, much more likely to end the constant progression of technology and progress, humanity, or whatever replaces humanity, will come up against some barrier that further technological development cannot solve. In this case, the progression of wealth growth will suddenly halt. The progressive antinomian bubble will burst, and civilization will take an enormous lurch backwards, this time in a truly catastrophic fashion, because after centuries and centuries of left-wing and antinomian victories, there will be little remaining of the social organization that will be able to cushion society when it is no longer able to rely on technological growth. Like a car hitting a brick wall at very high speeds, the entire external apparatus will be disintegrated by the collision, and with it, the death of the civilization and the people it deigns to protect. Leading up to this sudden catastrophe, the activists in government, the administrators of the society, and the culture may even see the disastrous fate that is ahead of them, but they have become slaves of the process that brings society forward. Like a government that is experiencing hyperinflation, the short-term interests of the party in charge is to always continue to print money to pay off short-term debts, regardless of the fact that it will lead to doom for the entire body politic eventually. And here we see another correspondence between Mencius Mollberg's theory of government and the very frequently revived idea of civilizational cycles, of the growth, life, and death of cultural groups and their civilizations over the course of centuries. The cathedral, once more the cultural consensus of a civilization, has a tendency always to move towards deconstruction, towards antinomianism, and towards the left. In our case, the Christian civilization's case, this process began with the Reformation. Then, slowly but surely, the cathedral begins to shed the external arrangements, the promises, the customs that have given it life in the past, until at some point it starts shedding and deconstructing necessary cultural apparatuses, and it begins its phase of decline. Here, Mencius Mollbug points to how, in Christian civilization, the initial Reformed Protestantism transformed into a socially progressive-minded Christian activism, then to a liberal progressive sentiment with no spiritual principles attached, and now finally to a progressive consensus that is obsessed with deconstructing and unwinding the very Christian civilization that gave it birth to begin with. A brief review of the reigning consensus of Harvard and Yale will tell this story very clearly. This is a tale as old as time, and it is very much the same civilizational cycle that we hear talked about by Spengler, and of course by much older thinkers than him. But at this stage, since we are more or less done with the theory, perhaps we can return to our own contemporary society, to the contest between left and right, between Red America and Blue America, and see how Mencius Mollbug's theories helps us answer questions about this fundamental division that has created a rift in the West. What is the fundamental difference between the left and the right, as they exist in politics today? Who is correct, and who, if any side, should we support? What is the left and the Democratic Party? They are the representatives of the true inner party of the cathedral, the societal consensus. They are the force that drives progress and the direction of the nation and the civilization as a whole. What is the right and the Republican Party? They are the representatives of the outer party, the token resistance that plies the brakes to progress, that slows the course of history down, and disagrees with the main representatives of the cathedral in a way that is acceptable to the cathedral itself. They are the loyal opposition. And so, which of these two sides do we want to support? Well, the left, obviously, at least if you like winning, and everyone likes winning. After all, they are on the right side of history. They're going to be the side that gets all the glory for the new social reform when they finally and inevitably come to pass. They're the ones that are going to have the satisfaction of saying, "I told you so," when we finally bring down the oppressive concept of monogamy and the antiquated notions of nations having borders. And if you have no moral problems with the aforedescribed progress, then it really is quite a good deal if you plan for a career in politics. There will be rewards, psychologically at least. But there is, of course, one small caveat, one small issue, and that is if you get the sneaking suspicion that our society, that our civilization is not in ordinary operating procedures, but is instead approaching the beginning of an accelerating, metastasizing decline and collapse. We may be on the cusp of that final step, the step where the left finally devours the essential social bonds for civilization, and then finally itself. In that case, assisting the left is only assisting in the hastening of your own doom and the destruction of yourself and your posterity. It's a possibility, but a remote one, right? Our current cultural leaders, our current governmental leaders have a handle on things. They certainly aren't going to pursue and allow any progressive moves, at least none that won't have ready technological solutions, or problems that can't be overcome by the increasing growth in wealth brought about by technology, right? And sure enough, maybe everything will work out. Perhaps universal basic income and wealth growth fueled by Silicon Valley will solve the problem of third world poverty and migration into the West. Perhaps robots and artificial intelligence will solve the problem of the decline of the family, the atomization of the individual, and the general loneliness of modern society. Perhaps cloning technology will solve the decline in birth rates, and machine-guided surgeries will solve the problem of transgenderism, to the point at least where no expert can tell between the biological women and the elective ones. I mean, we all have to decide whether this is going to happen or not. You either trust the technocrats who develop the cultural consensus of this society, or you don't. If you're a right-winger like me, then, for reasons either good or bad, you don't trust our current crop of leaders. But if you're on the progressive side of things, then in one way or the other, you probably do trust such men. We are headed straight for a techno-utopia, or perhaps even a singularity, and democratically elected technocrats are just the ticket to get us there. Of course, this decision, at the end of the day, has a certain amount of subjectivity to it. Everyone is going to decide for themselves who they're going to put their faith in. But before I move on to the last portion of this talk, and leave the decision up to the viewers, there is one more avenue I briefly want to examine before you cast your vote on whether our current societal trajectory is towards a utopia or towards total collapse. And this examination begins with looking at Robert Conquest's third law. Yes, the red-headed stepchild of the bunch that really nobody talks about. Law 1 and Law 2 look like commandments etched in historical stone, something that will be true now and true forever, but the third law just looks like complaint about bureaucrats. Pretty pedestrian. And it's not even really clear how it's related to the other two. Bureaucrats are inefficient. What a revelation, I never heard that one before. But when you stop to think about it, have we asked ourselves why? Mainstream conservatives like Ben Shapiro and William F. Buckley have answers to this question that are neat. Their answer is incentives. Bureaucrats are inefficient. They act like they're in a conspiracy against the institution because they don't have proper market incentives to act correctly. Corporations, they say, by contrast, do have proper market-based monetary incentives, and so their employees, at least, do not act like a conspiracy against the institution itself. But is this explanation true? Certainly, no one ever accuses the military of behaving this way, and it doesn't use market incentives. Furthermore, the mainstream conservatives' assertion that the employees of corporations do not act as a conspiracy against the company is really only true when we look at healthy companies. Companies that are solvent. Companies that are in their period of growth. Unhealthy corporations in impossible situations where their business model fundamentally fails do start to act just like Robert Conquest described bureaucracies. Their employees begin conspiring against the shareholders. Corporations exist for one reason: to pay off shareholders. They develop around some successful, prosperous business model and expand based on its success. But along the while, as they grow, corporations begin to change. The market shift, the founding leadership leaves and is replaced, and soon the organization has a new set of priorities that are not as strictly focused on shareholder value. And so the corporation loses focus and eventually goes into decline. And at some point, it becomes obvious to the management and to the employees that govern the company that the business model the company is based around is insolvent. And then suddenly, the incentives change. The priorities of the management stop being about delivering value to the shareholders in the long term, because the long term is futile. What matters is about getting out with what you have, looking out for number one, and to make sure that you're not the one who's holding the bag of shit when the music stops. And so, once decline is reached, management does become a conspiracy against the shareholders. And this very pattern is present inside governments and inside cathedrals. In many ways, it's useful to model both as corporations. Both governments and civilizations have shareholders, the citizens in the case of the government, and the general posterity of the people in the case of a civilization or a cathedral. Each also has assets and liabilities that it manages and manipulates to further the objectives of those stakeholders. And of course, when the institution, when the government, or when the civilization itself goes into terminal decline, those who are put in charge of managing those assets, who are in charge of the government or civilization or cultural property of a people, begin to stop acting in the interests of their stakeholders, begin to stop acting in the interests of the people, the citizens, or their posterity, and begin to act in their own interests. They begin to act in a mode of self-preservation. as a conspiracy against the very institution that gave them power. Perhaps Robert Conquest's third law is not as eternal as the first, but simply an observation about the current state of affairs, the transition of the leadership class in the West from a mode of delivering value to the people and their posterity to just another bureaucratic organization trying to manage the decline and get out of the door with their heads intact. And if this is the case, then indeed it is evidence that we are in the middle of a decline, potentially a metastasizing decline that will end in collapse. The music is slowing, and it may yet stop. But of course, again, this is somewhat subjective. We all have to decide how true it is that cultural, governmental, and educational leaders were more trustworthy and more interested in the people in previous eras of the West. I get the sense that people generally feel like this is the case, but there could be some nostalgic misremembering going on. Maybe there's nothing to worry about and we're on our way to utopia. But what if the music is slowing down, and what if we get the sense that the load won't bear, that we might be looking down the barrel of a governmental or civilizational collapse? This is the real red pill. And it comes along with a sort of sinking feeling when you realize the disaster that we might actually be staring at. But then, I think a certain relief when we know what might be ahead and what we have to do to prepare for it. And so here we might segue to the very obvious secondary question of what is to be done. How do we head off or lessen the impacts of this terminal decline? In Moldbug's estimation, the only solution was a reset. A sort of civilizational bankruptcy, where the old institutions could be cleared away, the old loyalties to government and reciprocal obligations could be upset and replaced with new forms of administration that would be more closely allied to providing value for the civilization and the country's main stakeholders, the citizens and their posterity. A sort of radical reorganization so that the original interests of the country, of the cultural institutions, can be reimagined, and something of the old can be restored. Now, as far-fetched and as vague as Moldbug is about this, it has a certain type of precedence, at least in corporate administration. Corporations that are no longer solvent, in the best-case scenario, are liquidated and reconfigured, so that their continued operation does not destroy and further injure the well-being of the stakeholders. One might also imagine something somewhat similar happening on a civilizational scale during the fall of the Roman Empire, as Rome's interests in the West became subsumed into various barbarian kingdoms, which, by taking charge of the empire in piecemeal, and by employing radically different organizational schemes better suited for the times, were, with a very, very long lead time, able to restore many of the same civilizational objectives as the original empire. Mencius Moldbug talks briefly about the kind of solution he'd like to implement, and to take a cursory glance, what Moldbug imagines is the combination of two ideas, neo-cameralism and patchwork. Neo-cameralism, being based off the original German cameralism, is the idea that the state is operated centrally and for the express purpose of its shareholders. Patchwork, a somewhat newfangled concept, is the idea of a decentralized collection of mini-states, each with enforced peace treaties and freedom of movement, a mixture of mini-corporate states from which anyone can emigrate. In short, Mencius Moldbug imagines a system in patchwork that is 100% choice and 0% voice when it comes to choosing a government. Now, many people consider the prescriptive dimension of Moldbug's theories to be the weakest and vaguest, and I'm certainly in agreement here. But I will note that most people who understand that we are in the process of decline and that radical reform is needed oftentimes vaguely allude to some kind of radical reorganization, though usually not nearly in as many words as Mencius Moldbug himself. What I think is more important, however, than the specific form of the reorganization is discussing how it can be achieved and lobbied for in the present system. If we do sense a decline is coming, if we do know that a reorganization is needed, and that the sooner this reorganization comes before the decline reaches its zenith, the better, then we are immediately confronted with how we achieve this objective. And here once more I think Mencius Moldbug's ideas are quite useful. We can start with what doesn't work. Perhaps what is most immediately obvious to anyone who's listened to this video thus far, what does not work is mainstream Republican politics. This is of course futile, and is futile by its very description. The point of mainstream conservative politics, the point of the Republican Party, is to operate as an acceptable opposition inside of the consensus, inside of the cathedral. It cannot itself be used to critique elements of that cathedral that have gone wrong. It's not within its nature. And if one attempts to bring hard reactionary, hard anti-establishment views into mainstream conservative circles, you may find that your fellow right-wingers are fighting you harder than they are the progressive opposition. Of course, this failure is well known to anyone in the contemporary dissident right. But just to head off another failed strategy, and a strategy that is very commonly discussed in lieu of political failures, it is also entirely futile to try to organize some right-wing militia movement, or to try to take actions in order to instigate a civil war, or an armed conflict against the cathedral and the societal consensus itself. Aside from, first of all, being almost an impossible conflict, fighting against the most powerful military force this planet has ever known, and a popular consensus that will probably carry the day insofar as it comes down to the average citizen. Our current cultural consensus, the present-day cathedral, has historically defined itself in opposition to right-wing militarized movements. What is the personification of evil? Well, obviously the Third Reich. What is the story about the salvation of America? Well, obviously the Civil War. In both cases, the villains are armed right-wingers, and any attempt to replicate this will be put down quite easily. The path to victory in this dimension has been totally cut off, both culturally and institutionally, and those who pursue it are pursuing futility. We shouldn't be looking in this direction for a solution, at least if we like winning. Instead, what Moldbug imagined as a solution, he termed pacifism. No, not the refusal to engage in war, but rather the refusal to engage with the political power structure as it exists, to essentially play a passive game against the cathedral. Elements of rebellion and revolution are not avenues that are open to people trying to fix things from the right. They are denied by the cathedral, and complaining that, well, the left can get away with it really isn't going to help. That would be like a pirate complaining once he is caught that state-sanctioned privateers were guilty of the same crimes he was. They were authorized, and in this case the left is authorized for revolution, and the right is not. Activism, passive resistance, and open revolution that are very loud work on the left because they are operating with the cathedral, with the cultural consensus that exists in our civilization as a whole. People like Gandhi and Martin Luther King were able to succeed largely because they had sponsors and sympathizers inside the intelligentsia and the cultural elite of the West. And the same thing goes for Marxist, communist, socialist, and left anarchist revolutions as they existed in the past and today. I don't need to remark on the relative acceptability difference between the Communist Party and the modern formation of Nazi parties, even though they both have somewhat similar body counts. Instead, if we're interested in change from the right, in change against the direction of decline, we have to think differently about what can be accomplished under the current constraints. We have to play a passive game of building alternatives. For Moldbug, this starts with building an alternative to the cathedral itself, starting with the most fundamental unit of cultural consensus, the academy. Moldbug imagines an alternative to the university forming, a type of anti-versity as he calls it, which operates under different principles, pursues areas of academic exploration that are shunned by the contemporary ideologies that reign inside the cathedral's consensus, and through this process begin to form up communities of learning, communities of knowledge that are respected, that are trusted, and that can create a beacon for people to rally around if our current cultural consensus goes wrong. It is important that this process goes on, in opposition to the consensus, but in no means directly confronting it, never trying to contest directly for power against a much more powerful foe, But from this, the seeds of a reactionary movement might be formed, something that can hold back and process a decline, an alternative that might be the salvation of our civilization, and maybe even the human race. Indeed, when I think of Mencius Moldbug's talk of the antiversity, I immediately think back to the fall of the Roman Empire and the role that the nascent Catholic Church played, both in creating a counter-narrative to the Roman bureaucracy and also being the new seeds of learning during the medieval era of European history. I think it still remains to be seen how much something like this is possible in the modern information era, but as authors like Rodriher have speculated when talking about the Benedict option, something like this is very obviously needed. So, after processing this part of Mencius Moldbug's ideas, in his ruminations on his blog Unqualified Reservations, where does this leave us? Well, I think at least with a new perspective on things, a foundation for the ideas that most people now call neo-reactionary. In many ways, neo-reactionaries, people who follow Moldbugian ideas or Moldbugian-like ideas, are preparing for the worst. But in another very distinct way, reactionaries oftentimes can tap into an inner calm. They're staring into the worst possibilities, and they know that they can, in part, hedge against it. Like most right-wing labels, reactionary is something that has been created by the enemies of the right. The main point of the title, when used in a modern sense, is to distinguish a reactionary from a mainstream conservative. Reactionaries do not want to slow things down. They do not want to stop history or go backwards to some previous golden age. They just believe that society needs, desperately, a different direction to go forward. If, in any way, the reactionary can said to be reacting to something, he is reacting to the manifest ruin that will be brought about as the result of the consensus's view of progress and the general direction of society. But in everything we associate with the label reactionary, I think there is one thing that a reactionary cannot be, and that is simply reactive. The point of neo-reactionary ideas is to anticipate decline, to build and cultivate alternatives, to make oneself worthy of power, and then, when necessary, take the appropriate action to secure it. Here is where we are left by Mencius Moldbug, agree or disagree. For those who are facing down the modern problems in the West, we must take the next step, find what works and what doesn't, and what models can be best used to forge something better for our posterity, regardless of what dreams or nightmares the future has in store once we have swallowed the red pill.